Our next guest is Judge Stephen Leifman from the Miami-Dade County Court Criminal Division. From 2007 to 2010, Judge Leifman served as a special advisor on criminal justice and mental health for the Supreme Court of Florida. In this capacity, he was responsible for chairing the court's mental health subcommittee, which authored a groundbreaking report entitled Transforming Florida's Mental Health System. This report, which has received considerable state and national recognition, outlines recommendations with the goal of decreasing inappropriate and costly involvement of people with mental illnesses in the justice system. Since October 2010, Judge Leifman has chaired the Florida Supreme Court's Task Force on Substance Abuse and Mental Health Issues in the court. Welcome.
In 1 minute, I'll tell you one. Thank you. Good morning. First of all, I just wanted to mention Richard Bonney and I are on a task force working to update the ABA standards on mental health. I just hope more people read it after we get done than the amount of people that have read and used it since 1984. I'll give you the book back. I don't need the handcuffs, though. Ellen, thank you so much for doing this. This is one of the finest collection of experts in the field. Everyone who is here, I hope, appreciates how fortunate you are to have the wisdom of a lot of incredible brains that are working in this arena. And I'm hopeful that after you get done with this symposium, you won't just put all the information in the back of your mind, but will maybe work to help us come up with a roadmap on how we really can turn this horrible situation around, because it is fixable. And there's enough information out there now, we know how to do it. You know, we've been talking a lot about criminal justice and mental health. I don't think until you actually get an opportunity to see what it looks like from the inside out that you can appreciate how shameful and how debilitating and how horrific it really is. And so I've brought a short video that was produced by my local CBS4 affiliate on what it looks like in the Miami-Dade County Jail and how shamefully we have treated people with mental illnesses.
Now, live, this is CBS.
There we go, that's it.
Now, live, this is CBS 4 News at 11.
Life here is dirty, deplorable, dangerous. Tonight, CBS 4 takes you to a place cameras are rarely allowed to reveal what's happening in our downtown jail to the inmates on the forgotten floor.
The people who spend their days and nights in these jail cells all suffer from mental illness. They're accused criminals, not guilty in the eyes of the law, but forced to live in conditions you cannot imagine.
Our chief investigative reporter, Michelle Gillen, has been given unprecedented television access to reveal what's going on. Michelle joins us now, and I was shocked, to say the least, when I saw this.
I think certainly it is time for the public to see what is going on. The pictures you are about to see are indeed haunting and most disturbing. Hundreds of men with mental illnesses, many crammed into tiny cells. Some arrested for minor crimes that advocates say would have the average person out of jail in just hours. But incredibly, there is no place to send them. Tonight, our cameras take you inside a world rarely exposed, the forgotten floor.
And then they get thrown into a cell.
I can't breathe, get me out. Prison insiders call this the forgotten floor, but it seems unimaginable that the horrendous, be it horrifying conditions of a jail spilling over with inmates suffering from mental illnesses could be erased from any sane man's mind. As frigid air is pumped into sealed cells, some beg for help for the barest of necessities, water. The faucets are dry. The water's not working.
The water's not working. He's drinking sewer water. He's drinking toilet water out of the toilet.
We'll get you water. It doesn't work, the faucets. The faucets aren't working. These stench-filled cells were designed for one person, outfitted with only a single steel shelf for a bed.
In this one, there's 3 inmates in a cell for one.
Yet 2, 3, sometimes even 5 men diagnosed with mental illnesses, in most cases arrested for low-level felony crimes, in some cases misdemeanors, are locked up for days, weeks, months. Tell me about you. Tell me, living in this, what do you want the public to know tonight?
I want the public to know that people in here, they're urinating on the floor, and we have to sleep on top of it. They're defecating on the floor, and you have to sleep on top of it. There's only one bunker that's made of steel.
How many people are in your cell?
There is 4 in here right now.
They are only allowed out of their cell for 15 minutes 2 times a week.
30 minutes a week they're allowed out.
So other than a half an hour,
That's it.
this is it. They
Right.
are in this room.
Lights are on 24/7. The conditions you see just do not change.
I've been in Vietnam. I've been in Vietnam after 18 months of Vietnam. It's worse conditions in here. I wouldn't put a dog in here.
A chilling perspective from the jail's chief psychiatrist, Dr. Joseph Portier.
You would think that in 2006, we would treat people with chronic mental illness in a much better, more humane manner. But unfortunately, we're reverting back to how it was in the 16 and 1700s, which is terrible. It's morally incomprehensible.
A sentiment echoed by an outraged Miami-Dade County Judge, Steve Leifman.
This is like a secret that people don't know
Yeah,
about.
it's a bad secret, and it's a sad secret.
What most of you don't know is that the Miami-Dade Jail now serves as the largest psychiatric facility in the state of Florida. 3 of 9 floors, burgeoning with inmates suffering from mental illnesses, and according to Leifman, in desperate need of treatment. Not this type of confinement designed to punish people.
5 times as many people in our jail with mental illness than any psychiatric hospital in Florida. 5 times.
In this, right here.
Right here.
An elderly man emerges from the dirt and darkness.
There's one on the floor underneath the bunk and 1 or 2 standing around waiting for their turn to sleep.
And the crisis has unfolded across the state. In other Florida jails where they strive to comply with all the national standards for housing inmates, frustration over the virtual abandonment of mentally ill inmates left by the state to languish in jail cells for months runs deep. Colonel David Parrish.
Can you imagine the chaos that would result in the local criminal justice system if I stood at the booking door and said, sorry, we don't have any more room, we're not taking them from you, law enforcement?
Parrish from Hillsborough County says local authorities had no choice but to sue the state of Florida to force the Department of Children and Families to comply with their legal mandate to transfer mentally ill inmates to a treatment facility within 15 days.
Jails should not be the de facto mental health facility for a county, but that's what they are in the United States.
You had your birthday here. How old were you?
I was 21.
21.
Yes, ma'am.
And you've been here 8 months.
Yes, ma'am.
In Pinellas County, the weight of incarcerating and caring for mentally ill inmates had everyone paying a price, an unacceptable one, according to Major Kirk Brunner.
We are not a treatment facility, and these people that you saw in Delta 1, the one that plucked his eye out, they need to be in a treatment facility, which is the responsibility of the state, not our responsibility.
And therein lies the danger. William Weaver Sr. was caring for his 40-year-old son Bill at home, a son he says suffered from schizophrenia but functioned well for decades until his medicine was changed. Then one night, according to police records, he attacked his elderly father, who called police and urged them to arrest his son, hoping this would trigger treatment.
Because he was under the false idea that if he got arrested, he'd get treatment.
Bill ended up locked up in a cell on floor 9 of the Miami-Dade Pretrial Detention Center for several months. According to authorities, Bill jumped from this top bunk bed, cracking his skull and breaking his neck. He's now a quadriplegic who needs hospitalization to stay alive. We met up with his father, who had just left his hospital bed.
Do you think anything has come from what the incident of what your son went through?
Nothing. Nothing's changed. Do I think something could change? I don't know. I don't know. It's time. It's time. Something changed. But I don't know if it ever will.
It's a painfully sobering look at what really goes on in our society. I will tell you, when I became a judge, I had no idea I was actually becoming the gatekeeper to the largest psychiatric facility in the state of Florida. Unfortunately, our courts, our jails, our law enforcement have truly become the first responders for people with mental illnesses. My journey into the mental health world actually began one morning when I was getting ready to go on the bench. I was approached by the assistant public defender and the assistant state attorney, and they asked me if I would see a couple whose son was in jail on a case I was just about to hear. At the time, we had no training for judges in the area of mental illness. The only thing I was taught was if someone acts strange or bizarre, order a psychological evaluation. I have no idea what was supposed to happen after that, but that was the extent of my training. This lovely couple came into my courtroom. They were very sophisticated, and they were horribly distraught. They started to tell me a very sad tale about their son, how he was a brilliant man, how he'd gone to Harvard and had a late onset of schizophrenia and was now recycling through the criminal justice system, and they just didn't know what to do anymore. I was relatively new at the time, and I think when you're a new judge, you think you have a lot more power and a lot more wisdom than you really do. And I made the mistake of promising them that I would get their son help. You see, I was under the same false impression that most of us have, is that if you're sick and you get arrested, there must be some treatment system we put you into, because I deal in logic, and that would be the logical conclusion. As I got up and I started to go back into the courtroom, the mom stopped me, and she said, "There's one more thing I'd like to tell you about my son." She said, "He's very smart. He can be very manipulative. But, Judge, he probably knows the mental health system better than you, because you see, my son is the former head of psychiatry at Jackson Memorial Hospital in Miami-Dade County." I had the same reaction as you. I was pretty much taken back. I went into the courtroom and I called his case, and he stood, and he, in fact, was brilliant. And in fact, he knew the mental health system better than I did. And we started to have this amazing conversation. If I wasn't looking at him, because he looked like a homeless guy who hadn't showered or bathed in months, I clearly was talking to an articulate, brilliant psychiatrist who was educated at Harvard. He was thoughtful, he was coherent, he was smart, and in some ways, he was more respectful than the lawyers, no offense. And he kept insisting there was nothing wrong with him. Oh, and by the way, he was already in jail, I think, a few weeks on a really serious charge of possession of a dairy cart. In Miami-Dade County, there's a county ordinance, it's not even a state law, that if you are possessing a grocery cart off the property of a grocery store, it is a second-degree misdemeanor, punishable by 60 days in jail. A lot of homeless people pick up those charges because they use them to keep their worldly goods. So he said, "Judge, I didn't do what I've been charged with. If you release me, I promise I'll come back. I'll even go see a psychiatrist, but there's nothing wrong with me. But please, you need to let me out of here." And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, my God, maybe there's something wrong with his parents. He was so clear. There didn't seem to be anything wrong with him. And I said, "Can I ask you one question?" And he said, "Sure, anything, Your Honor." I said, "I just don't understand one thing." I said, "If you really don't have a mental illness, why would a Harvard-educated doctor be homeless and recycling through the criminal justice system?" And whatever I said triggered a crisis right in front of my eyes. He started to shake back and forth. He started to put his hands over his ears. He was hearing voices. And he got a look on his face that I can only imagine someone has right before they think they're going to die. And he started screaming at the top of his lungs like a wounded animal. And he started pointing to the back of the courtroom where his parents stood. And he screamed, "Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Honor, you have to have that couple removed. You have to have that couple removed. You have to have that couple removed." Again and again and again. And I said, "Well, aren't those your parents?" "No, no, no," at the top of his lungs. My real parents, they died in the Holocaust. And these people are from the CIA, and they came to kill me today." His parents almost collapsed. His mom was crying. His dad was shaking. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. I did the only thing I had been taught to do. He clearly was acting different. I ordered an evaluation. He was now in another couple of weeks. The evaluation came back. It said he was incompetent to stand trial and in need of involuntary hospitalization. I needed 3 evaluations at the time to get a stipulation, so I needed to leave him in a couple more weeks. 2 more evaluations were ordered. All 3 came back, said he was incompetent to stand trial. He needed involuntary hospitalization. I gave the evaluations to the lawyers. They immediately stipulated to his evaluation. I began to order him into involuntary hospitalization, and I noticed the assistant public defender had a grin on her face. I will tell you, I am a former assistant public defender, and the grin is a really bad thing. Now, I'm in a law school, so lawyers will appreciate this more than anybody. She then uttered those words that lawyers just cringe when they hear. She said, "Your Honor, in all due respect." For those of you who are not lawyers, it has nothing to do with respect when they utter those words. It means you're an idiot, you don't know what you're doing, and you have to do something different. She whipped up a Florida Supreme Court case, which of course I had never heard of because we had no training, that basically said that county court judges, of which I am, have absolutely no legal jurisdiction to involuntarily hospitalize anybody. I basically had one option, and it was to release him back to the street. And I will tell you, we don't become judges to be part of that kind of problem. I put him at risk. I put the community at risk. I probably put my job at risk. But it was a horrifying thing. I was unable to fulfill the promise I made to his parents, and I just couldn't believe the law was that ridiculous. I left the bench. I was pretty disgusted. I got on the phone, and I started calling around. And I learned 3 very, very valuable lessons that day. The first lesson I learned is that we had a very serious mental health crisis in Miami-Dade County. As it turns out, we have the largest percentage of people with mental illnesses of any urban area in the United States. It's actually almost 3 times the national average. 9.1% of my general population, that's 177,000 adults and 55,000 children, live very difficultly with a serious mental illness in my community. And I'm talking bipolar, major depression, and schizophrenia. The state of Florida is 49th per capita in mental health funding, so only 1% of the people in Dade County actually have access to treatment. So the Dade County Jail has become the largest psychiatric facility in Florida. It's really not 5 times as many people. I was conservative back then. I got more information. We have 10 times as many people in our jail with serious mental illnesses than any state hospital. And because we have done such a lousy job, or had up until that point, training our law enforcement, 21 people since 1999 with a serious mental illness have actually died during an encounter with law enforcement because the law enforcement wasn't trained on how to handle them. People with mental illnesses generally stay 8 times longer at 7 times the cost in jail because we don't know what to do with them. We spend $160,000 every single day, that's $60 million a year, to warehouse them in that horrific facility. That was the first lesson I learned. The second lesson I learned is this was not just a local problem, but as it turns out, it is a state and national problem as well. Former Surgeon General David Satcher once said, Mental illness is the silent epidemic of our time. I will tell you, if you work in the criminal justice system, there's absolutely nothing silent about this epidemic. And the third and maybe more difficult lesson is that our community mental health system, like yours and everybody else's, were developed over 40 years ago when most people with the highest acuity of mental illnesses and other issues were in psychiatric hospitals, and they were never developed to handle people with such high acuity of illness. They slip right past them and right into the criminal justice system. I think we can only fix it if we understand how we got here and what the main problems are today. When our country was founded, we didn't know what to do with people with mental illnesses. And so loved ones would literally take their family member to a local jail and they would drop them off. And they would stay there until whenever. This kind of hit the apex when the wonderful Dorothea Dix was visiting a local jail in Boston, and she came across 14 men who were literally freezing to death in the back of the jail. I find this so ironic, but she went to see the jailer and she said, "Excuse me, who are these men and why are you allowing them to freeze to death?" And he said, "Look, lady, they're just a bunch of lunatics," because that's how they referred to them back then. "And they haven't done anything wrong. They haven't been charged, so I don't have any money to treat them." Such a humanitarian he was. And so she was outraged that this one person, this one woman, started an entire national movement called moral treatment. And the idea was to take people from these horrible jails and put them in these small 120-bed asylums, which had a good meaning back then. And we could treat people with humanity, which was remarkably progressive since this is in the early 1800s. In this, we had no psychiatry, we had no medication, but she knew there was a better way. And because of her efforts, by 1900, every state in the country had a psychiatric hospital. Now, you know the states, they're not going to just have a bunch of 120-bed facilities. That's going to cost too much money. So they started to consolidate these facilities, and they built these houses of horrors. And they built these facilities, and some states had 15,000 patients without any kind of oversight, without any kind of treatment. And they started experimenting on people. They became human experimentation facilities. They found that a lot of people with mental illnesses had slightly elevated blood sugar levels. So the geniuses said to themselves, "Aha! It's their diabetes causing mental illness." So they went around and they started using insulin shock therapy as the first treatment for people with mental illnesses. And of course, that didn't work. People got sick, some died. So they said, "You know what? We're onto something. We'll just take a couple electrodes, stick it on their heads, charge them up, and we'll shock them back into sanity." And when that failed, they said, "You know, we'll just cut a piece of the brain out and do a little piece of a lobotomy, and at least they won't be overactive." And that went on, believe it or not, up until almost 1980. And that's why all those laws came about in the 1980s to try to change the way we were dealing with that population. So in 1963, in what would become his last public bill signing, and it's 50 years this year, President Kennedy signs a $3 billion authorizing act to create this wonderful national community mental health system, because a lot of people don't realize, but his sister Rose had been lobotomized. He was very sensitive to the issue. Wow, not even close. You sure? Okay, I started late. All right, I'll pick up. All right, so unfortunately, due to the president's assassination and the escalation of the Vietnam War, no real money was put in to fund the Community Mental Health Act. But at the same time, a whole slew of lawsuits got filed. And the most interesting case I've ever read in this arena is a federal case out of Alabama, Wyatt v. Stuckney, which is a seminal case that actually leads to the deinstitutionalization of our hospitals. The case ends up in front of this brilliant jurist, Judge Johnson, and the case actually was not filed by advocates for treatment. It was filed by the medical staff to save their jobs, because you see, in Alabama, they were using a cigarette tax to fund the hospital system, and the tax was going to be cut. Doesn't this always sound familiar? And so the first people that were going to get reamed from the tax cut were the people with mental illnesses, and the doctors were worried about losing their jobs. So they filed this case, and it ends up in front of Judge Johnson, who's a appointee by President Johnson, and is the same judge that frees Martin Luther King out of Alabama jail. He's a really tough son of a bee, but he's great. And he says to the docs, "Look, you know, I'm really sorry you may lose your jobs, but, you know, you're SOL. I have no jurisdiction to tell Alabama who to hire and fire." However, he says, and he reaches in and he finds a way to grab jurisdiction, and he has the most amazing adjectives in an opinion I've ever read in my life. And he goes on to say this is the most despicable, disgusting, grotesque facility he's ever seen in the United States, and he's going to fix it. And he says to Alabama, look, I'm going to order you to make 80 specific changes to your facility. And if you don't do it, if you don't do all 80, I'm shutting you down. Now, I don't think Judge Johnson ever wanted to deinstitutionalize. I think what Judge Johnson wanted to do was to force better treatment of people with mental illnesses. Well, Alabama hemmed and hawed. They started to make some changes. The case gets appealed. It goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court. And for the most part, it's affirmed. And so there is a shockwave in this country. And what the proposition, what the case stands for, is that if you are in a civil facility, not just a criminal facility, the government is responsible for adequate care for people with mental illnesses. Well, now if you're a state, you have to make these 80 changes. I mean, he even went so far to tell people how hot the water needed to be in the dishwasher in the Alabama facility because they weren't cleaning utensils and people were getting physically sick. Well, the states then had two choices because he said, if you don't do it, I'm shutting you down, I'm putting this population back in the community, and you're going to be stuck with it. And he thought that would be enough to make him do the changes. Well, it wasn't. And so what do you think the states did? They went out and they closed down those hospitals as quick as they could because they wanted to save the money and they didn't want to pay the money they were going to have to spend, which was billions of dollars, to fix it. But President Kennedy's community mental health system was not established, and there was nothing to absorb this population. The impact has been staggering. In 1955, there were some 560,000 people in state hospitals in this country. If you use today's population, it would have been about 1.5 million today. Last year, there were 2 million arrests of 1.5 million people in this country with serious mental illnesses. On any given day, there's about 750,000 people with mental illnesses in jail and prisons, and about another 1.25 million people on some type of community control with a mental illness. We have decreased the number of hospital beds by 90%. We've seen an increase of the number of people going to jail by 400%. I'm not advocating going back to hospitalization, but it just is a fact of what we're trying to deal with today. So we have two horrible ironies. Number one is we never deinstitutionalized. What we in fact did is we transferred responsibility of these really horrible, crappy state hospitals to really horrible, crappy jails. But now you get a criminal record with your mental illness. So now you don't only have to deal with the stigma of having a mental illness, now you have to deal with being a criminal with mental illness, which makes it harder to get employment, it makes it harder to get housing, and it makes it more likely you're going to continue to recycle through this system your entire adult life. The second and maybe sadder criminal irony is number one is we've come full circle. We've now gone 200 years, and jails are once again the primary place for people with mental illnesses in this country. It is the only area in civil rights that we've actually gone backwards on, and it is very shameful, and it's just remarkable how we have failed people with mental illness. The consequences have been clear. We've seen homelessness increase. We've seen police injuries increase. We've seen police shootings of people with mental illnesses increase. We've wasted critical tax dollars. And in fact, we made mental illness a crime in this nation. My police in Florida actually handle more mental health involuntary hospitalization cases than the total number of arrests that they make for robbery, burglary, and grand theft auto combined. And if you think the costs are insignificant, just listen to this. In Miami-Dade County, we asked a university to do a study to tell us who the highest utilizers of criminal justice and mental health services were in our community. I thought they would come back with a list of thousands of people because they have this great computer system that looked at criminal justice, mental health services, everything in one blend. They narrowed it down to 97 people. And I guarantee every community has 97 people. These 97 people, primarily men, primarily diagnosed with schizophrenia, over a 5-year period were arrested almost 2,200 times. Spent 27,000 days in that jail, 27,000 days in that jail, 13,000 days at some type of psychiatric facility, and cost taxpayers almost $13 million, and we got nothing for it. And what's happened on the state level, and it's killing all of us, is we've developed this bizarre entitlement called forensic competency restoration systems. Because we had this wonderful idea 50 years ago that if you got arrested with a mental illness, we should restore your competency so we could try you. That would be the right, just thing to do. Well, that maybe made some sense in 1950 when we had 5,000 people nationally with mental illnesses in jail and prison. But now today when we have 750,000, all those people are getting pushed into this very expensive system that does nothing. In my state, 1/3 of all of our adult public mental health dollars, a third, almost $250 million, $250 million, goes to trying to restore 3,000 people a year. 3,000 people. I have 170,000 people a year in my state who at the time of their arrest need acute mental health care treatment. But a third of our money goes to restoring them so we can try them. Nobody gets tried with mental illness. Maybe one. Okay? 80 to 90% of the people that come out of that great, grandiose system have either one of three things happen to them. They either get credit time served and walk out the front door without any treatment, they get probation and walk out the front door with no treatment, or the charges are dropped because the witnesses have disappeared and they get no treatment. And we spend $250 million a year for that. And where do you think the money comes from? They don't raise taxes anymore. They don't look for new revenue anymore. So they take it from the community mental health system and they've squeezed it to death so that they could push whatever little dollar they have left to restore competency so we could let people out. It meets the definition of insanity. We keep doing the same thing again and again, and we expect a different outcome. The fastest growing subpopulation in my prisons in Florida are people with mental illnesses. It has grown by 170% in 10 years. We went from 8,000 prisoners with a serious mental illness to 18,000 this year. Now, they're not going out and committing horrible offenses, which is why they're in prison. We all have point system. They're just accumulating over time. The average person with a mental illness in my prison system spends 2.5 to 4 years. It's grown so fast that the Department of Corrections is asking to build 10 new prisons over the next 10 years just for people with mental illnesses. Let me tell you something. The cost to build 10 prisons and operate them for 10 years for people with mental illness is almost $4 billion. There is something grotesquely wrong with a society that is willing to spend that kind of money to incarcerate people for 2.5 to 4 years than to treat them. And so what's causing all of these problems? There's three things, I believe. Number one is the financing of mental health is abysmal. Not just the spending of it, yes, there's not enough, but how we spend it is as big of a problem as anything. All of the financing of mental health is still based on 40 and 50-year-old ideology. It's all based on this deinstitutionalization model, and it's ludicrous because we know that treatment's important, but equally important to the treatment is the social rehab type pieces of it, clubhouse models, meaningful day activities, intensive case management services, trauma services. But you have SAMHSA, which is this wonderful agency with all these evidence-based practices, and you have CMS, which is your Medicaid dollars under the same roof, and Medicaid won't pay for the best practices that SAMHSA recommends. The other part of it is we have something called an IMD exclusion. It goes back to trying to promote the deinstitutionalization of our state hospitals, and it limits the states from using Medicaid to pay for more than 16 beds. Well, maybe, 50 years ago when they came up with that idea, it made sense because we want to close those hospitals. But hospitalization has to be part of any kind of medical treatment. My God, if you have heart disease, you're out most of the time, your heart gets worse, you need a little bit more extra work, you go in for a little bit and you get a tune-up. It helps. We need more hospital beds to be able to get treatment. The other part of it is our system is so horribly fragmented. Thanks to Hank Stedman, my hero, and the reason I'm able to do all this is because he is our guiding light, and I'm not kidding, and I don't have time to go in all of that, but suffice to say this. He helped send an expert to Miami to help us figure out our system. And while we didn't do this exercise, just talking about it explains what a disaster the system is. They took a bunch of folks like us in this room, judges and prosecutors and state attorneys and police chiefs, and they took them to a local park in Seattle. And they took their shoes away from them, their purses and wallets. And they said, you have a mental illness. Tomorrow morning, you need to be in court at 9 in the morning. And at 10:30, you need to go see your probation officer. At noon, you need to go see your psychiatrist. And at 2, you need to go pick up your medication. Good luck. We have developed a system that works for people that aren't sick, 9 to 5, 5 days a week. And even if you didn't have a mental illness, it's still pretty tough to navigate. We did not develop a system that works for people that are sick. And that is part of the contributing problem. And the third part of it is our involuntary hospitalization laws are 50 years old. They're based on old science, old ideology, old medicine, and they don't work. We did a study in Florida that showed us if someone is involuntarily hospitalized more than 2 times a year, there's a 92% chance they get arrested that year. It needs to be readdressed. It needs to be adjusted. Now, when we went and did our Supreme Court report, and we did that because we had a wonderful judge in Florida hold the former secretary of our Department of Children and Families, in criminal contempt of court over this issue because they weren't taking people out in a timely fashion. And we got together and we did something really unique. We looked at research and data to make public policy. What a novel concept, right? And what we found is that there are, I call them, Hank has like 8, I have 10 essential elements that a community needs in order to really fix your problem. And what you need is to have the proper diagnosis and treatment, which sounds a lot easier than it is. And the gentleman that was speaking with bipolar order is a classic example. There's a study out of Emory that says that it takes the psychiatry community, yes, the criminal justice system is very much to blame for a lot of this problem, but so is the psychiatric community. It takes 10 years to get a proper diagnosis for someone with bipolar disorder, and it's usually after 3 misdiagnoses. And what often happens, because bipolar disorder manifests itself in depression, people don't go to a psychiatrist, they go to a general practitioner, and they complain of depression. And so they get an antidepressant, which triggers mania for people with bipolar disorder. We've had people arrested that were perfectly fine until they got the wrong med and went out into the street totally naked because they were in a horrible manic state, and then we had to deal with it because the psychiatrist misdiagnosed. So number 1 is you need to have proper diagnosis and treatment. You need intensive case management services. You need trauma-related services. I don't know if Hank went over this yesterday, but we know after a longitudinal study from SAMHSA that almost 100% of women, 92% of all women, this is the most sickest thing I've ever heard, 92% of all women in jail and prison in the United States with a mental illness have severe, severe trauma, most of it sex abuse. So let's talk about this. A 6-year-old is raped. She's traumatized. Mom doesn't want to leave the bad stepdad or the crazy next door uncle or neighbor, because she's getting the money. The kid's now traumatized. She's an outcast. She goes to school. She's now having PTSD symptoms. She becomes a problem in the classroom. She gets kicked out of the school. Mom doesn't want her back at home because the stepdad's messing with her. She becomes homeless. She's having nightmares. She can't sleep. She turns to drugs. She then turns to prostitution to pay for the drugs, and her entire adult life is now spent with me in the criminal justice system because she was raped at 6 and we didn't address the problem, and now we re-traumatize her back in the criminal justice. 80% of men who are in the jail and prisons with serious mental illness have trauma. Our communities must have serious trauma-related services. We need to deal with long-term institutionalization. We need supportive housing, supportive employment, and as Jen Scheme talked about yesterday, yes, it is very important to address the criminogenic factors. About 80% of the people that come in my system have a substance use problem along with their mental illness. A lot of them hang out with people that do bad and silly things. A lot of them have literacy issues. And so not only does someone need serious mental illness, they also need cognitive behavioral treatments. And you have to have a coordinated criminal justice response like CIT, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And the 10th one, I believe, is we need to start using sophisticated technology to eliminate the fragmentation of our community mental health systems. We will never have a single-payer plan in this country, so we have to get smarter than that and use technology. Now, really quick, we have tried to do as many of these essential elements in my community. We have the largest trained force, and I was thrilled what you were talking about because it works. I have almost 3,900 police officers in Miami-Dade County who are now trained in crisis intervention team policing. It has been the most remarkable cultural shift I've ever seen in my life. Last year, 2 of our 36 agencies, our 2 biggest, Miami and Miami-Dade, they're all trained. They handled 10,000 mental health calls. They only made 45 arrests. Miami is not different than LA. If you looked at a police officer wrong, you used to get arrested. Okay? Our jail audit had the largest reduction in the United States. We went from 7,800 inmates 2 years ago to 5,000 this year. We closed a jail last month because we didn't have enough people to put in it. We've trained the 911 call takers to make sure they were asking the right information so I could get a CIT officer out there. We have an executive training program for the brass at the police agency so they know how to run it and keep it. we put together 3 post-arrest diversion programs. So now, if you were that psychiatrist that gets arrested in Miami, no longer do we order all these silly evaluations. Within 24 to 48 hours of your arrest, you are seen by someone in the jail who's a trained professional. They can order what's called a professional certificate, and within that day or the next day, we have you transported to a crisis stabilization unit. We are allowed to leave you there for a couple weeks because the 72 hours doesn't apply because it's a criminal hold. I have 6 peer specialists that the court pays for. 3 of them have come through my program. They go out and they see the person, they work with the individual. We have reduced our recidivism from 75% to almost 20% of our misdemeanor population. We now have a felony diversion program. So if you get arrested on a felony, usually within a month of your arrest, you're seen, you're out, you're stabilized. That program in 4 years is maintaining a recidivism rate of 6%, and the county has now saved 35 years of jail bed days. 35 years by getting people out and keeping them out. We have a whole list of other services that we're providing. Suffice to say, we're doing a cognitive behavioral pilot program right now, and the shining piece for us is we were able to get the state to lease us a new facility, an old state hospital about a mile from the courthouse for $1 a year for 99 years, which I offer to pay every year because I know my county will default. And don't laugh. And we got the taxpayers in my community to pass a $22 million bond issue, and we're taking that money and we're creating the first of its kind in the country, which will be a forensic diversion facility. It'll be part jail, and it'll be a crisis unit. It'll be a short-term residential facility. It'll have a clubhouse-type model. We're going to build a culinary program for supportive employment. We're even looking to build a huge, beautiful supportive housing complex on top of the parking lot next door, and we'll have all the services that you need to recover. And so instead of kicking you to the curb because you have a mental illness, we're going to wrap our arms around the people that need wrapping and make sure that we gently and slowly reintegrate them back into the community so they get the supports they need for recovery. Now, we still have a long way to go. I'm done. And just to say this, we still have a long way to go. I need my state to step up and make some changes at a state level. But I am convinced if we continue to move forward in the direction we're going, we will finally meet and succeed what the Supreme Court asked us to do 50 years ago when we moved towards deinstitutionalization. Thank you very, very much. Sure.
Do you want to do some questions, quick? This lady in the back.
You have the largest psychiatric facility in the country. I just have it in my state.
In the mental health program.
Okay.
So I have a few colleagues here as well. But you talked about, so I have a couple of questions, I think. The certificate that the psych clients get.
Yes.
And you send them away to a facility.
Mm-hmm.
Do they receive involuntary medication? Is that like a hold but not a hold?
One thing Florida has, even though we have no money, is we have independent crisis stabilization units, which are like emergency rooms outside of a hospital setting just for people with mental illnesses. And so I didn't have time to get into the whole thing that Hank helped us do, but we developed this collaborative agreement, and I actually have all the signatories of all the different, I have 6 public receiving facilities in Dade County because we have such a huge problem. And what we do is we take them to a crisis stabilization unit. And one of 2 things happen. They can voluntarily take treatment if they wish, and if they don't, the doctor there can then initiate a hearing for involuntary hospitalization. So we push them into the civil system and take them out of the criminal system. But what we also do is we work with those individuals, and if they agree to go into our program, which is a 1-year, very impressive treatment program, with all the psychosocial supports you need, the state usually drops the charges within 30 to 90 days. And what we've found is we don't need to keep them under supervision during that period of time. They do just as well without me. And the other thing, and this is really important, when people are talking about setting mental health courts, there's a lot of good in them, but it's not a panacea and it's not the answer, because they only handle maybe 1% of the people with mental illness in the criminal justice system. Plus, what happens because of the politics of it all is the state attorneys don't want the people that really should be in the mental health courts. They want the people that don't have criminal justice backgrounds that are going to succeed. And the data is showing us that it's a mistake to keep them under criminal justice involvement for two reasons. One is anybody that's going to be watched 24/7 on probation, including all of us, is likely to do some kind of violation, whether it's technical or substantive. So you end up putting people with mental illnesses in jail longer. The second is you take people that don't have the criminogenic factors and put them together with people that are real criminals and start to teach them some really new bad lessons. So if you're going to do these programs, what you want to do is you want to divert first people that don't have high risk factors, and Jen and Hank and the Council of State Government having some wonderful risk assessment tools you should use. And so for the people you know aren't coming back, get them right back. They're going to be fine. They're an outlier of an arrest. But the ones that have the other factors, you want to wrap around and you want to give them more intense treatment.
One of the problems that we have is our inpatient unit at LA County is not large enough. So we're dealing with the issue of having a high number of highly acute clients that are outside of the hospital, and we're kind of trying to figure out what to do with them. And so outside of the MIST, and I think you talked about that program where we can involuntarily treat them outside of that hospital, do you ever see a time where we would be able to treat like at-risk or sort of 5150 candidates involuntarily but not in a hospital? Because I know with the due process, it's just
one of the best things, and I think, I like to tell people this, but it's true. It's really good to be judge. And I can pick up the phone and make people come to a meeting that ordinarily don't want to go to that meeting. And what I found, and we had this summit that Hank funded for us 12, 13 years ago that started all this, is when you get everybody in the room that is involved and doesn't even realize they're involved in this, and they start to understand how ridiculous it is. It's not nefarious. This wasn't done intentionally. It's just that we're all so busy doing our jobs, no one's looking for the one person that's actually touching all the systems. So if you can get them in the room, and you can get the sheriff to bring him in or a judge to bring him in, and you can start to lay out a plan, there are ways out of this. And what we have found is it's cheaper to set up a separate unit outside the jail setting or a hospital setting, and you get a much better return on the dollar. So it's not necessarily about saving dollars, it's reallocating dollars and using them where they need to be used to get better outcomes and allow people to actually recover.
Just one last thing, and I'm so sorry. I did talk with the individual that handles the training for our clinical staff, and we are just, starting to bring aboard CBT. And so I have recommended sort of like a CBT training ground in LA County Jail, and also because we have AB 109 inmates who are staying longer, so they get more help. So, and then I like your jail diversion program. I think
we're doing we got a big grant to test CBT, but we looked around the country and there are no CBT programs, that's cognitive behavioral treatment programs, for people that are not in an institutional setting. So thanks to Dr. Scheme, we actually found someone that's been doing close to what we want in London, and we flew her over. And we've modeled our program after her work. And we took two groups of 50. One group is getting treatment as usual, and the other is getting treatment as usual plus the CBT, and we'll let you know in about a year. But the early outcomes look pretty good.
Dave Meyer again. Judges are remarkable, extraordinary change agents for the good in the areas that you've addressed, of which you are a prime example. And you mentioned Judge Johnson, who's done any number of amazing things in that state, and we have experience with dealing with our own prisons through Judge Carlton and a three-judge panel, Judge Henderson, three-judge panel who virtually shut down our state prisons over issues of health care and mental health care, really made a huge difference, and even the U.S. Supreme Court blessed what they did. So judges can make an immense difference. That being said, where the rubber meets the road is state trial judges, of which you are one. But it is those judges who are willing to take the chances and break the rules that are necessary to make
Can't
these
say I
changes.
broke any rules.
Oh,
For the
yeah.
record.
Oh, yes.
I'm on video.
Oh, yes, you did.
I had the blessing of my Supreme Court when I did it.
State trial judges are subject to elections, which federal judges are not. Once they are confirmed, they're through with politics and can do whatever the heck they please, pretty much. State judges are not that way. How can we protect, insulate, empower our state judges to do some of the things that you and very few others in our state and others have done to improve the criminal justice systems dealing with mentally ill
It's
individuals?
a terrific question. And Hank recognized this 13 years ago in Las Vegas and began a program called the Judges Leadership Initiative, which I now co-chair. And we just got a tremendous amount of funding through the American Psychiatric Foundation to work with psychiatry. We have about 300 to 400 judges on our listserv, and we have developed all kinds of training in certain areas to help them do this. One is to teach them that they can and should be doing this. There is an association of Supreme Court Chief Justices that meet once a year, and we went to them and they passed a resolution unanimously saying that it was okay for state judges to do this. So it gave us cover. The second thing I found that surprised me when I first started it, my former chief judge, who's a really wonderful guy, came to me privately and said, "Steve, you sure you want to do this? You know, I'm looking out for you, and I don't want this to hurt you when you have to run, because I don't think this is good politics." And I didn't become a judge to keep my job. It's, there's other things I can do. And I will tell you, the greatest irony to my decision is it saved me as a judge. When you have to run, in my state particularly, it's nonpartisan. I'm in a minority in Miami-Dade County because I'm a white Jewish boy, and there aren't too many of us left. And when people don't know who to vote for, they vote for their own race, creed, or gender. And so we're vanishing. And so when I had to run and I had opposition, I had something to talk about. And I crushed my opponent. And the Hispanic community totally embraced me because of this project. Because when 9.1% has a mental illness, it's affecting 30 or 4%. They have mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, and people wanted help. And so my message to my colleagues, and I teach around the United States to judges, this is good for you. And so we're getting over that barrier. And not only is it good for you, it's the right thing to do. And so we now have all kinds of training programs in Florida. We have a program for new judges that I teach. It's an hour and a half, and we start to orient judges on this is important and it's the right thing to do. We have a 3-day training program called Advanced Judicial College in Florida. We do 3 days of training on mental health and how to set up collaborative agreements in your community. And then we have general training at our county and circuit court conferences at least once a year. So our judges are getting culturally shifted just like law enforcement needed cultural shifting, where in Miami the police are not allowed to begin writing as a police officer until they have gone writing with a CIT officer. So it teaches them this is how we talk about people with mental illnesses, this is how we treat them, and so you start with a rookie understanding, and the same with a rookie judge, this is how we do it. And that's how you change it, and it doesn't happen overnight. So, I know you want to stop, so I can take questions.
One quick question.
I'm fine. I don't want to.
What happened to that 2006 jail forgotten floor?
Okay, it's still there, but, thank God for the internet. It went viral, and I don't know how, and lo and behold, the Justice Department sued us. Could you imagine that? So, the new facility will be opening in about a year. We're going to close the 9th floor, and we're fixing it. In fact, Tuesday, the county commission's signing off on the settlement agreement, And I actually delayed the settlement agreement because I wasn't happy with where the county was going. And we actually have an agreement now, and it's going to be fabulous.
Good thing you don't break any rules.
That's not a rule. It's all transparent. Thank you very much.